Hello and welcome to the web series on India's foreign policy. We intend to have discussions on Indian foreign policy and the current events in relation to the Indian foreign policy. In order to understand foreign policy of any nation, we need to understand international relations and the system at the international level. In order to understand present international system and international relations, we need to have a look at background of international relations. So in the first episode, we are trying to cover certain areas such as the origin of international relations, the stages of development of international relations, and at the end of the episode, we'll also talk about the difference between international politics and international relations. This is essential to understand foreign policy of India in the current context. So let us look at one by one the different contexts of this episode. We'll begin with origin of international relations. International relations begin with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We say so because the basic unit of international relations happens to be the concept of nation state. The concept of nation state was born of this Treaty of Westphalia. Westphalia happens to be the province of Germany, and it was a peace treaty essential. Before Treaty of Westphalia, the principle which governed world affairs was the principle of imperialism. It is important, it is noteworthy that after Treaty of Westphalia, the principle which governed world affairs was changed from one of imperialism to the principle of territorial sovereignty. And from that concept, the concept of nation state comes into existence in the continent of Europe. So with the beginning of this concept of nation state in Europe, we say that the international relations started in modern sense of the term. The current system, international system, is actually Westphalian in character. That's why it becomes all the more important to understand the origin of current system. However, the current system of international relations has underwent a lot of changes over a period of time. We'll talk about those changes and how those changes came about in 20th century especially, and what was the world system about before the Second World War. Hence, we need to divide this entire development into certain stages. We'll do so by considering four stages. Stage number one is from the Treaty of Westphalia up to the process of decolonization. Stage number two is after the end of World War II up to the end of Cold War. That is precisely the period of Cold War politics. The third stage would begin with the end of Cold War, which can be called as post-Cold War period. And recently, there is a lot of debate about post-globalization world, which happens to be the fourth stage of our discussion. We'll begin with the phase one, which starts from 1648, that is the Treaty of Westphalia, up to the process of decolonization. In this period, the international relations were confined to Europe because in other parts of the world, there were kingdoms, empires, and colonies. So in strict sense of the term, even the foreign affairs existed in terms of nation state, international relations were confined to Europe. Nation state happens to be the most important unit of international relations during this phase. And that is precisely because that is the most important factor or the actor in international relations. Other actors of international relations came into existence later on in 20th century. So during this phase, what dominates international relations is nation state. In terms of different powers in the world, we need to understand that the world was multipolar during this time. But one change that we must understand is from Treaty of Westphalia up to decolonization. Decolonization is a process which started long back. However, it picked up speed after Second World War. So during this time, it is international politics which dominates international relations. We will talk about the difference between international politics and international relations at the end of the episode. But we must understand that it is international politics which dominates international relations during the first phase. In the second phase, which starts with the end of World War II, that is with the beginning of Cold War, is very important in terms of changes which came in international relations. We must understand that the character of international relations is still Westphalian in character. That means it is still dominated by the sovereignty of nation state, concept of sovereignty. So, territorial sovereignty is an important principle which governs international relations even today. But the changes which came after Second World War are significant. We'll talk about those changes first. So, the first thing which we mentioned in the first phase, that is decolonization, gave birth to a number of nations, or rather newborn nations, in different other parts of the world, notably Asia, Africa, and American continent. So, as a result of the process of decolonization, we can say that international relations became global territorially. That means international relations, which were so far confined to Europe, became global in terms of territory. Couple of other important characteristics of international relations in this phase. One is the rise of new nation states that we talked about. Other, the rise of new actors apart from nation states. That is how the scope of international relations widens during this time. The other actors that we talk about in this phase are international organizations, regional organizations, non-state actors, multinational corporations, and transnational organizations. So all these became important actors of international relations alongside nation states. So we also need to discuss these factors when it comes to understanding of international relations. This is regarding actors. Even the domain of international relations underwent change. Rather, it increased like anything in the post World War era. And certain important issues like Cold War, we talk about arms race and disarmament, nuclear proliferation, ecological balance, which came in 1970s, North-South conflict alongside the East-West conflict of Cold War, and most importantly, complex issues of economic interdependence started dominating international relations. This is how the scope in terms of functional areas increased in international relations, and that becomes an important factor we need to consider when it comes to foreign policy of India. We must note here that the foreign policy of India started in this context. Apart from the rise of new actors, the rise of new functional areas in the international relations, we must understand the character of international system as such at that time. We talked about the fact that the world was multipolar before World War II, which became unipolar as a result of World War II. So, Cold War period is marked by bipolarity. And in addition to that, we can say that this bipolarity had ideological overtone to it. That means there was a competition between capitalist USA and communist USSR. That was one important feature of Cold War international system during which Indian foreign policy was developed. So the world became bipolar in terms of global powers during post World War II, or so to say Cold War period, and number of new functional areas came in. So it becomes very complex in terms of understanding of international relations. However, we must also understand it has to become more complex in the coming next phase. Uh, During this time, world was divided in two blocks. However, we also need to understand the role of non-alignment movement, and in terms of economic system, we need to understand the role played by new international economic order. Because during this time, we talked about the role played by new actors. Apart from nation states, we see development of certain regions as well. For example, we can talk about the economic system which was developing at the international level. If you look at the previous phase, it was clearly dominated by nation states. However, in this phase, new regions come up, a system develops. We see some kind of crystallization of international systems. It could be political in terms of UNO and different other organizations. It could be economic in terms of World Bank, IMF, and GATT initially, which, with addition of GATTs and TRIPS, we have WTO in 1990s, but it comes in next phase. So some kind of crystallization of economic system is witnessed here. Apart from that, the regime to contain nuclear proliferation. So nuclear non-proliferation regime is another important feature that we see here. In 70s, the issue of ecological balance becomes important, and we see certain conferences and the efforts at the international level coming up in order to prevent ecological damage or environmental damage. So these are important features of this phase. That means new issues are to be considered, new actors are to be considered while devising foreign policy in this phase. The next phase begins with end of Cold War, which can be called as post-Cold War period. Here, one change which is very clear and obvious is the world which was multipolar before World War II becomes bipolar during Cold War and becomes unipolar in the post-Cold War period. So world becomes unipolar. So it is marked by unipolarity and US hegemony in the world affairs. US dominates the decade of 1990s. Apart from the nature in terms of powers in the world, we also need to take note of the process of globalization which became prominent in 1990s. There are different reasons behind it. We can talk about neoliberalism becoming prominent since the decade of 1970s and 80s. However, with the end of or rather collapse of Soviet Union, any alternative to liberalism and so-called LPG, that is liberalization, privatization, globalization ideology, uh, uh, the option of Soviet communism ended with the end of or the collapse of Soviet Union. So the speed of globalization is very high in 1990s because it is promoted by the most important global power in the world at that time, that is USA, and there is no alternative apart from capitalism for different nations in the world. That is how at least it was portrayed. It could be called as a propaganda as well on the part of Western nations. So USA and the Western nations promoted globalization at that time, and the Soviet Union, which was an alternative, ended as an alternative, and the various scholars in the West also declared the triumph of liberalism, and they came up with the theory of end of ideology as well. So it is sweep of globalization, which is another important characteristic of post-Cold War world that we witnessed since 1991. Apart from these two important factors, that is unipolarity, US hegemony on one hand, and the sweep of globalization in terms of economics, we see transformation in the concept of security and economic development. Just to have a brief understanding of this, the conventional or the traditional concept of security underwent a change. Now, at the center of security, instead of nation state, which was the conventional understanding of security, instead of nation state, we see individual at the center of the concept of security now. So there's a major change in terms of the concept of security, and globalization is one of the factors behind it. So today, the understanding of security is in terms of individual. Different dimensions are added. So individual needs to be protected in different dimensions. It is not just about the freedom from fear. It also talks about freedom from wants. Freedom from fear is ensured by defense and law and order, but freedom from want requires security from different dimensions. It could be food security, it could be security of employment, it could be security of livelihood, it could be environmental security, and it can be stretched up to cyber security. So, concept of security underwent a transformation with the beginning of this phase, and even economic development, which was so far talked about in terms of GDP. Now, new concept came in, which can be called as human development, especially with the contribution from Mehboob Haq and Amartya Sen. The third important aspect that we are supposed to understand here is the role of UNO, because during Cold War phase, UNO had little role to play because it was paralyzed by the superpower rivalry between UNO and USSR and USA. If we look at the structure of UNO, the most important organization happens to be Security Council. And these two nations, USSR and USA, were part of Security Council as permanent members, which enjoyed individual veto power. So anything that UN wants to do at the world platform requires the sanction of P5 from UN Security Council. But the kind of power politics that we saw during Cold War, it was impossible to develop consensus between USSR and USA at that time. So in post-Cold War phase, UNO came out of that superpower rivalry, and this time it could play some role. However, we know that the performance of UNO rather was a mixed bag always. In terms of post-Cold War period, UNO can take credit in terms of human development, and that comes from the program of MDG, Millennium Development Goals, which has a mixed result. But at the global scale, if we look at achievements under MDG, that is a very credible work done by UNO. With the end of 1990s, we see some other things coming up in 2000s. One is global terrorism and post 9/11 world. That is supposed to be one important turning point in international relations. 9/11 changed all the equations in the world. Global terrorism became an important threat to the world. USA declared war on terror, and all the equations in Middle East, in the world in general, changed with 9/11. It must be understood that P5 developed consensus on this particular issue of global terrorism, and hence we see overthrow of Taliban government from Afghanistan with the help of P5 sanction. That is why it is generally said that what happened in Afghanistan was a result of international security assistance forces and not the work of USA alone. However, US went ahead with attack on Iraq as well, in spite of there being no sanction by UNSC. That indicates the hegemony of USA in the world affairs. We must understand that 9/11 was a display of how much terrorism has become powerful in the world. However, we must also understand that what happened after 9/11 indicates the power of USA or the display of power of USA in the world affairs. So world changed after 9/11, and we must understand that the process of globalization was underneath the fact that terrorism became global. So this is phase 3. The last phase of international relations is called post-globalization phase. Post-globalization phase is something that is highly debated, discussed today, because we are seeing certain important events happening in the current affairs, which are shaping the world order or international system, which has got impact on foreign policies of all the nations. We can mention Brexit. People are already have started talking about post-Brexit era. We are witnessing the Donald Trump's policies today. So such things are indicating some kind of anti-globalization stance taken by some important nations in the West. It is interesting to note that the very nations which promoted globalization are opposing it today. At some point of time, when the relevant discussion comes up in terms of important current affairs event, we will talk about these events in detail in next episodes. However, we are talking about these events in terms of how international system is changing in this episode. We'll limit our discussion to that as of now. Apart from these important changes which indicate some kind of post-globalization world, we also need to talk about the power distribution in the world. It is said that as a result of what happened after 9/11, that is US entanglement in Afghanistan and Iraq, which has been very much protracted, plus the economic slowdown that we witnessed in 2007-8, there is some kind of a relative decline of US power. That is how scholars look at it. That means there is rise of other powers as well, notably China, India, South Africa, Brazil. And nowadays we are talking about re-emergence of Russian power. And it is more to do with the military power that Russia enjoys under the leadership of Putin. So what we are seeing today, is it some kind of indication that world is moving towards multipolarity? That's an open question and debatable topic. In this sense, connected to this point, that is, world is moving towards multipolarity, this debate on another topic, some people are saying that is it a beginning or is it an indication of beginning of new Cold War today? Precisely, scholars say that probably is the beginning of new, probably we are saying, this is beginning of new Cold War between US on one hand, which happens to be comprehensive power even today, and military power Russia, economic power China, and energy power Iran on the other hand. So this is how we can also talk about some different contexts coming up in the world today. In this quick overview, what we have learned is the world is today Westphalian in order, no doubt about that, because even today the territorial sovereignty and nation state happens to be the most important actor in international relations in spite of the rise of other actors in the world. But this Westphalian system has underwent a lot of changes. We took a quick overview of all the changes which have happened so far. Towards the end of this session, we'll talk about now the difference between international politics and international relations. I kept it deliberately at the end of the session because whatever has happened so far has got some kind of a link to the difference. I said that before World War II, there was dominance of international politics. We must understand what is international politics. International politics is about official relations between nation states. However, it confines itself to official relations, that too between nation states. International relations is much more wider term compared to international politics. It includes international politics as well as it includes other actors and the new functional areas which came up precisely in the second half of 20th century after the end of Second World War. We talked about it. So, international relations has a wide scope which includes international politics, non-official relations, other actors, and new functional areas, something that we discussed in the overview. So, this was a quick overview of how things have changed in the international relations, which defines the context to understand foreign policy of India, which happens to be our core interest. The major takeaway from this episode has to be the fact that in order to understand international relations in general and foreign policy of India in particular, one needs to understand the context of the world affairs in which these relations develop. Thank you.
Press the bell icon on the YouTube app and never miss another update from the Unique Academy. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned.